I learned all sorts of new terms and differences between court and passage tombs, and realized that I have to hit the books and learn a lot more. But there's plenty more places that I found out about today that I'd love to visit in terms of how unique the landscape is, and that we really need an effort to preserve it so that as the tourism goes up, that we won't destroy it with people being able to appreciate it, but not destroy it by, climbing on them or removing materials.
And what happens at this moment is that on the 31st of October, the sun will shine in direct alignment with that chamber and illuminate the chamber and cast a shadow on the belly of the capstone, the huge slab that sits on the top of the Stochel, this monument. And gradually, over the course of winter, something is going to happen. There's going to be progress. It's going to gradually rise further and further south as the days shorten and the journey of the sun becomes shorter. And by the time you get to roughly about the 10th of December, it's reached the winter solstice position, or approximate, which is down a little bit down the side of the fourth hill on the right, this hill here. It'll just be sitting down somewhere where we are now from that vantage point. It'll wait there for 13 days or so. From the point of view of a normal observer, that's your perception. The solstice isn't a minute, it's a process. And then slowly the sun will work its way back again and go to the saddle again. And on the 10th of February, we didn't know that the 10th of February was the equivalent date opposite on the horizon, the 31st of October, but it is. And it shines down and illuminates the chamber again, and that shadow creeps. It would, without the modern reconstruction, would do it for 20 minutes. As it stands now, it does it for about 11 minutes. And a couple of years ago, Mark Roddy, who's one of the team here that's with us today, myself, stood at both of the sites. At another site, I went to Tara, to Dúmanagíl, another Duma, the Mound of the Hostages, another Neolithic passage tomb. Again, reconstruction done there, but we have to put caveats and attachments like we do with some of these other sites. The sun shines in directly in line with the central chamber at the same time, but it's about something like 17 minutes before in Meath. So as the planet rolls around, the sun will shine in, and then you wait in Sligo, you wait. No bonfires, St. Patrick was told, were lit before the Tara fire.
The reason I'm stopping here is that we're looking down at Ballygawley Bay, and literally the Ox Mountains on the far side of Ballygawley Bay. And to your left, you could see the hill of Cailleach, where we were this morning. And then behind me, it's a strange way to put it for you standing in different places, but you can see a very pointed hill. It looks like a pyramid. Can you see that? And that's Cruachan, on top of which there's a small passage tomb excavated about 15-20 years ago by myself. A small passage tomb built on the very, very small summit. And the summit is not more than kind of 10-15 meters in diameter, and then the hill just drops. A small rectangular chamber with passage tombs finds in, and a series of dates that was too wide to give some kind of good indication, but it seems to have very early dates as well as fairly late dates. But a passage tomb. And the reason I'm pointing out that is that you can see that little hill. It stands out very much in the Ox Mountains. And to the right of that, on the higher hill to the right, the first high flat summit, you can make out to the very left edge of that summit, you see a small cairn. And that's Dumore. Dumore is a rather substantial cairn, about 20 meters in diameter, with a chamber and a long passage. But you can't get into it, but it's really a complex site. Those are the only two sites on the summits in the Ox Mountains on the kind of Mayo side of Ballygawley. And then you have the four sites where we were this morning. So that really gives an idea of the screen of sites that they built on different summits in the Ox Mountains. And you could wonder why all the summits wouldn't have cairns or sites, but I think they picked out certain aspects of that skyline or certain aspects of that mountain range to be used for the ritual monuments. Dumore maybe for being the highest part in this part of the Ox Mountains, and Cruachan maybe for its spectacular shape.
And we talk about, is this a question of, I wrote that book, and at the time at the end of it I had a section about how many of the characteristic landmarks of Gaelic kingship were oddly and weirdly and out of sync attached to an ancient passage tomb at the centre of Carramore. Footprint stone at the entrance stone. You know, the petrosomatic lift that is associated with Gaelic kingship right. A nearby hill called Crohan, Liz Fitzpatrick cites that as a sine qua non. You have to have that if you're going to have a Gaelic inauguration site, and so on. And I asked the question in the little book, and you'll see it if you get in your copy, is it possible to talk in terms of Neolithic dynasties?
This brings me on to the fact that they were really, and this is what makes the passage tombs in Ireland, and especially in the West, so unique in the way that they're actively using the landscape. They're not only placing their tombs on a high spot or an elevated site. They're actually placing them in certain locations in the landscape to create visibility and also to create intervisibility between sites. So the way that they're related to the landscape is something that we don't see in literally in any part of Western Europe when it comes to passage tombs. And this really makes it unique.
Stable isotopes are a way in which we can talk about the environmental conditions in which someone grew up, the latter stages of their life spent, and the food that they ate and what the preference was. So if you like, the simple version of it is up on the top right of the graph are the people who ate more terrestrial diet, ate more meat perhaps, dairy products, and down on the left hand side are the vegetarians, the veggies, and the people who ate the fish. And so the indication being that in the passage tomb studies that we did, we find the passage tomb crowd, as opposed to other monument types and the general Irish and British population, up to the right in the meat-eating, milk-drinking gang.
The Swedish passage tombs in Falbygden in southern Sweden, they are in a highly agricultural area with table mountains in limestone, 15 or 20 table mountains. This passage tombs looks like the Irish passage tombs, but where are they placed? They are placed in the lowlands. Not a passage tomb goes near the high ground. So the same type of tombs, but a completely different concept of how landscapes relate to the ritual or to the ancestors or to the future society. And that is really telling, I think. That it's something that really stands out. And we see it not as clearly as in Sweden, but you see it even in Portugal. You have dolmens in Portugal, or passage tombs, that would be located on high ground. Okay, but they don't have that kind of tight link with the dynamics of the landscape that we see in Ireland and is so well expressed in Ireland. And this is something that really Cailleach is outstanding when it comes to trying to convey, and we can see that so clearly, the way that the sites have been used and placed. And that's the reason why I wanted to bring you to Grange North, where we were just a few moments ago, how they actively have used the spur of the hill to probably overlook their paths down in Carramore, to put it simply. So they're using it very, very with kind of intentions. And same comes to this site in Cailleach and where we were this morning, that they are also placed on 3 or 4 summits that really stand out. They're soft summits. They're slightly, I mean, the skyline is very soft. And you have to imagine that these cairns today are ruined. They probably were a bit more kind of cake-like, not necessarily as the reconstruction of New Grange, but they might have had straighter edges, so they would have stood out to that skyline in a different way than today. So they knew exactly what site or where to place their monuments.
Out of that, we took 6 people at Cailleach, and of those 6, 2 were female and 4 were male. That's and roughly corresponding to the percentage of people who went into the monument. Of the dead in Cailleach, about half and half were cremated and were not cremated. And we see the genetic sequences told us the story of the origins of those people, that they had ancestral origins way back in Anatolia, what's today Turkey, with the early journey of farming, probably through the Mediterranean. All the indications were of that. But the isotopes told us another story, that they had grown up, most of them, except for 2 outliers. 24 of them, of the 22 of those 24 had the signature of growing up reasonably near the Cailleach site where they were interred. So these are people who are living here, but their ancestral origins are somewhere else.
For those of you that know Sligo, we have Abbey Quarter, a lovely small passage tomb of Carramore style in Sligo town, just beyond Lidl in Dorley Park, sitting on the bank of the Garravog River. Again, on a small ridge, the only ridge overlooking the Garrabog, at the place at the Garrabog where the Garrabog River narrows into a small river leading into Sligo Bay. They knew exactly where to place it, and they did. And that's the way that we're trying to read the landscape and to understand the background to these sites. So they're not just placed out wherever.
And the other thing that has happened in the last couple of months, and you've probably seen headlines about this, is that the sequences at Cailleach became a template to compare other sequences to that had emerged from other parts of the country. Some were on record and some were newly sampled by Lara and the team. And they were able to draw familial, detectable connections between different sites in Ireland. The one that we should all be talking about is the one from Carrowmore. And in Carrowmore there was about 7 or 8 people buried, probably 8 minimum individuals now, because one new individual has been found through his tooth, and that tooth was sequenced in Sweden. And it was a relatively short sequence, but we had the full genome of the people in Cailleach. So when Lara placed it opposite each other, here were matches. So we could draw a familiar connection across time, distance and centuries between these people. The person that was buried in Cailleach was buried there 5,550 years ago, give or take 90 years or so. He was male, he was in his 20s, and with him was another man who was in his 50s, and he had been defleshed ritually. Again, a big topic. We'll give you a reading list at the end to talk about all the topics we touch on very briefly here. But long story short, that man had a familiar connection to another man who was buried in Millen Bay, which is in Northern Ireland, on the very east coast of Ireland, and in Newgrange as well. And furthermore, another connection, and that was on about 350 years after the man died in Cailleach.
The big picture is what we're trying to understand, and at the end of that we're trying to understand people, because they were like us but in a different area. How were they thinking? What were the kind of thinking behind this? And of course every site was placed in a kind of very detailed and very careful way and directed by certain rules or regulations. And that's the, coming back to the big picture, the tripartitioning of the landscape. That's the big picture of the passage tomb tradition.
Another connection was to Newgrange and Millen Bay, and another and the person in Newgrange was another male, and that male lived again, as I say, about 350 years after the person in Cailleach, but was a 6th degree relative of that person. He could have been a second cousin or something like that. So that connection was established. So it made a connection, and then there were other connections from the guy in Newgrange. When you sample his sequence, that can go backwards in another way and connects him to different people buried in Cailleach. So another thing that grabbed the headlines about that was that the individual in Newgrange, his parents were probably brother and sister. So you were looking at incest, and the people who wrote the paper, Dan and Lara and their team, argued for a dynasty. A set of people who were in Ireland, who were getting buried in these tombs. And I said to Lara there, we've done an interview, she'll be published on the Doc website in the next week or so. And one of the things, you know, she said, you know, these monuments from now on are going to be associated with people. They must have been associated with particular people when they were made. And again, for now, we're beginning to make that reconnection and re-establishment to connect them with people.
But that is also why the link between Cailleach and Cailleach is so important, because we are literally talking about the same people, the same ideas, but expressed in slightly different ways in Cailleach than up here. And that's the reason why the kind of interplay between these two clusters becomes so important. And I think that is also what makes this landscape so unique from a, well, as I say, the World Heritage Site perspective, that it really differs from literally all other megalithic tombs in Western Europe. I must say, I'm very biased here, but I mean, that's the way it is. And that's the way that's what we're trying to convey by promoting this as a World Heritage Site. So it stands out in a serious way in the bigger picture.
As Europeans, obviously issues of identity are extremely important politically, culturally, socially, more today than ever before. I mean, that's probably true of any time period. But what we have, which is so visible, it surrounds you and it speaks to you in terms of location, in terms of identity, in terms of cohesion of a society, that everything we can learn about it, I think, is going to teach us something about ourselves.